Hi guys, welcome back. Today we're going to talk about the Renaissance, and we're going to look at the Renaissance specifically in Italy. Over time, the Renaissance, what we refer to as the Renaissance, spreads into other parts of Europe, but it begins in Italy, and so that's what we're going to look at today. The Renaissance becomes known as this explosion of art and creativity and a change in thinking. And so it's an important time for us to be looking at. The Renaissance period, we assign in history to about 300 years, 1300 to 1600. That's a huge amount of time. So the things that we're going to go over today, they don't happen overnight. They're gradual changes. They happen over the course of several hundred years. They don't happen to everyone. The Renaissance primarily impacts the wealthy groups, but as time passes and as some of the thought process starts to change and people start to ask different questions and people begin to view things differently, then we see eventually the formation of some of these ideas into some later revolutionary thought. So Italy is the prime spot for the Renaissance for a few different reasons. First of all, by this time, around 1300, Italy has a lot of thriving cities. A lot of their big cities have seaports, which are constantly engaging in trade and commerce, and the cities grow, and so they have these big cities. It's important to note this because, as we're going to mention lots and lots of times in history, ideas spread more quickly in urban areas where there are areas with large number of people and people who are going and coming, right? In this case, trade, travelers coming to and fro to these big cities in Italy. The ideas travel with them. So ideas can travel in rural areas too. It's not impossible, but it takes longer just because of people being spread out and not interacting as often. So because Italy has these big cities with lots of traffic, then they become this prime place for Renaissance ideas to flourish. Italy also has, because of these large thriving cities, a very wealthy merchant class, a group of business owners, shopkeepers, bankers, government officials we'll talk about in a minute, a lot of clergy members who have wealth. And so that is one of the things that's going to become a key component of the artifacts that we use to remember the Renaissance, is that there's this wealthy class that is able to allow for some of these things to happen, financially, allow for some of these changes to occur. The other thing Italy has going for it is really its location. Not only because of the trade, as I mentioned earlier, but during the time of the Renaissance, they try to bring back the classical ideas of Greece and Rome. So that early Greek and Roman civilization, those aspects of the culture, a lot of the philosophies and the architecture and the ideas come back during the Renaissance, and that is in Italy. So they have it already in their heritage. It's in their own history already, those ideas. And so when they try to bring it back, to revive it, they don't have to travel to find their inspiration. It's already there. So they're playing on their aspects of their history to bring back these classical pieces. In fact, Renaissance means rebirth. And so that rebirth refers to bringing back the classical ideas of Rome and Greece, the philosophy, the education, the theories, the architecture. And that is what that rebirth refers to and where the Renaissance gets its name. So, as I said, overseas trade is allowing at this time cities in Italy to become very wealthy, merchants in Italy to become very wealthy, as well as allow for the exchange of ideas and that commerce. Another thing that travels, unfortunately, as we know, is disease. So near the beginning of this era, Italy had been struck by the plague, which is just absolutely devastating in all parts of Europe, especially in Italy. And the plague hits, there are some different episodes of the plague in European history. This one, the bubonic plague, is particularly devastating. And the estimates are that Italy lost about 60, over half of their population in the plague. So 6 out of 10 people were lost as a result of the plague. That's a huge percentage of their population, which again is very devastating. But as the time passes, it actually has a very interesting effect on the population that is left. Because there are fewer people in Italy, there becomes a greater demand for an increase in wages. It's not, as we see later on in history during times of industrialization, where there are so many people looking to do the same job, fighting for the same job, that business owners can offer a low wage because somebody's willing to take it. It's the opposite that's happening in Italy during this time. There are so few people that business owners are actually forced to increase their wage in order to attract people to their business as employees. And so we start to see just a slight increase in wage. It fluctuates through history, of course, but that is an important thing to note. Because employers are now being responsible for maybe paying out more money, they begin to reevaluate their business plans and look for additional ways to bring in revenue, additional ways to expand their business, and that, again, contributes in many ways to the growth of the merchant class and the growth of trade and the growth of commerce in Italy during this time. So with this wealthy merchant class in Italy that is, again, not overnight, but as a result of the plague and the demands on them over time, the wealthy merchant class grows. They become very, very wealthy. And as a result, they become very influential in many of the city-states as well. And we see many of these merchants becoming involved in politics, becoming involved in the government. Oftentimes, usually, almost always, for their own benefit, right? In a way to increase their wealth and their power and their influence. This brings out some new ideas. Many of those in the merchant class, not all of them, but many of them did not come from families that were historically wealthy or historically noble. And so there emerges this new idea of those who work hard to gain wealth and influence should have the same opportunities as those who were born into wealth and influence. They felt like they should have the same opportunities as those who maybe were born with a title because they perhaps were equal financially at this point, but maybe did not have the same family line. And to us, this is not a really strange idea. This idea that you work really hard and you sacrifice and then you are rewarded in some way, whatever that means for you. That's very much a basis on which Western civilization is formed later on, this idea of hard work and persistence. But at this time, it's really very strange to consider that somebody who was not born into nobility could somehow be eligible for a noble title or a noble rank or a role in the government, which was not traditionally set aside for someone not from a prominent family. And so it's a little change in ideas that are then going to grow and spread and lead to some later on revelations. So an example of one of these families, there's a few very notable ones, is the Medici family. Also heard it pronounced Medici. I think it probably depends on your accent and which language you're speaking. But the Medici family is a very famous family, and they are one of these merchant families. Over the course of time, they gain money, wealth, they gain power, they gain influence, and they end up being one of the most influential families in Italy with some really incredible connections. Growing through this time of the Renaissance. So the Medici family, they began as bankers and again became involved in local politics and local government and continued to move forward in their involvement in the government. And eventually one of the members, Cosimo de' Medici, becomes the richest man during his time, the richest man in Europe, not the richest man in Italy, the richest man in all of Europe. And so that's, again, a very incredible feat for this family. They become very, very wealthy. In 1434, he had, again, through his banks, gained a lot of influence and control in the government. And later, his grandson, Lorenzo de' Medici, would actually take on a leadership role, and he becomes known as Lorenzo the Magnificent. One of the Medicis becomes a pope. One of the Medici daughters marries the King of France. And so the Medici family, again, becomes very, very powerful during this time, and a good example of one of these families that just grows in their influence in the course of this time period in Italy. So back to Renaissance ideas. And it's again challenging for us because many of the ideas that we look at in history are things that are normal to us, are not unusual, but that represent such a shift in thinking at the time that they're really important to note. So during the Renaissance, the scholars in Italy become very interested in more classical and more worldly views and philosophies. And they use these ancient Roman and Greek philosophical writings to influence their thinking. And they develop this way of thinking that we now call humanism. And humanism is an intellectual movement that focuses on the potential of an individual. So what can an individual create? What can they learn? What can they influence? And what can they create? Today, if you were to take a humanities class in college or as an elective or somewhere, or read a humanities book, it would look at the way in which history and the events influence what people create. So things like literature and art and music and poetry and sculpture. What goes into creating that? What influences that? How can those things be a reflection of what was important to the people at the time? Sometimes we also refer to the humanities as a group of subjects. You may hear like English and history referred to as the humanities versus the science. It again is very much focused on what can individual people learn from all these different places, put together and create for the betterment of themselves or for others. And again, you today have a very humanities-based education in order to help you be well-rounded and have the tools you need to be productive. So you don't just learn math and science, you study literature, you study, in history, we look at pieces of art and we look at these ideas, right, and decide how everything works together and how it works for us. So this is a concept that comes together during the Renaissance. So humanists, again, given all that explanation I just gave, humanists really encourage the continuation of producing art, literature, architecture, sculpture, music. There's a big focus on creating that as a way to represent the thoughts, the feelings, the emotions, things that are important to the people who are creating them. So religion during the Renaissance is a little bit of a tricky subject because it doesn't go away. In fact, we'll look later at the Reformation, which happens at the same time as the Renaissance. They're happening together and overlapping, which is very much focused on addressing the religious systems of the time. So religion is very, very important in the people's lives during this time. However, what changes is that the humanist thinkers during the Renaissance begin to promote this idea that you shouldn't focus so much on what will happen after you're gone, but instead focus on what will happen while you're here, right? Living your life now instead of living in a way that is only going to affect you perhaps in your afterlife. And so that idea, by the way, is challenged. In no way does everybody agree with that. It causes a lot of conflict in Europe, in fact, but it brings up some interesting questions and changes about what is expected of people. What should people do to really show their devotion? Many religious thinkers and religious theories at this time are arguing that in order to show your devotion, you should avoid luxury. You should wear very simple clothing. You should eat very simple, plain food. You don't need to do anything elaborate or extraordinary, but live a very simple life. And then again, with the idea that you would be rewarded later for that. And humanists begin to argue and ask why. Why can't we enjoy things, enjoy beautiful art, enjoy elaborate clothing, enjoy these magnificent churches while we are worshiping our God? Why can't we do both? And so a lot of the Renaissance art and architecture reflects this idea of enjoying life while also being spiritual, which again challenges some other ideas that we will come to later that create a lot of changes all over the world. So most people in Italy are Catholic and remain Catholic, devoutly Catholic, and the Pope is incredibly influential and in fact is influential during the Renaissance, but the focus starts to come away from, again, that idea of suffering to show devotion and instead enjoying what they referred to as worldly pleasures, things here and now that make us happy. So as a result, we see a lot of these wealthy members of society begin to become patrons of the art. A patron is someone who financially supports a cause. And so the very wealthy families like the Borgias and the Medicis, as well as the wealthy members of the clergy, including the Pope, begin to financially support projects that promote these ideas, promote art and expression. So this is also leading to a little bit of a change in art, and we're going to talk about art at another time. But we start to see during Renaissance art more personalized art, because it is the wealthy people who are hiring someone saying, I'd like you to come paint a picture of my family. We see pictures, paintings of actual people, not just perhaps the king and queen, right? Not just the person in charge, but rather pictures painted, portraits painted of ordinary people, wealthy ordinary people, but everyday people. We see architecture or sculpture starting to reflect the families that request the art. The Medicis, for example, would put their family crest onto all of their buildings as a way to self-promote, to show their wealth. And why not? They're paying for the building. They'd like their family crest to be there. And so we start to see these personalized aspects of art appearing during the Renaissance that we didn't used to see before. And so this, again, shifts the focus of art from what it had been in a prior time. We also see literature becoming more about individual people, how they feel, how they react, what they're experiencing, instead of just, historical records or community records. We see stories written by average people, and talking about average people and intended for average people. Writers begin to write in the vernacular, the language of the people who are around them, so that, again, average people could actually read the literature. Things stopped being written exclusively in Latin or in Greek, or for people to actually read, and it becomes much more accessible to the average person. And so that really is a good way, a good ending point here to consider that during the Renaissance, with this rebirth of these classical ideas and this change in thinking, we begin to see more focus on individual people and what they are experiencing. And that is reflected in what we know and what we see about the Renaissance time. So we'll be back later to talk more about some of the famous artists of the Renaissance and how they fit into the changes that are occurring. Thank you for watching. See you later.